Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. President Biden, flanked by a veritable army of unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, have made their goal very, very clear. Their goal is to hinder fossil fuel production on federal lands and in federal waters by any and every means necessary. And they're doing quite a job of it. In tandem with the climate provisions of the Orwellian-named Inflation Reduction Act, which congressional Democrats passed last summer, new regulations are coming out of the Department of Interior, the EPA, CEQ, and even agencies like the Securities Exchange Commission have chilled capital investment of oil, gas, and coal production. This at a particularly inopportune time. You know, the Democrats' war on fossil fuels has only added more risk, more uncertainty, more suffering to this process and to the countless permitting obstacles that energy projects were already facing. And this is contributing to a situation in which energy prices and inflation are making Americans even poorer. At the same time, when they're suffering from the rampant inflation that we have faced over the last 2.5 years because of excessive federal spending and excessive federal regulatory intervention. Instead of allowing American operators to produce domestically, the Biden administration has done everything that it possibly can to slow domestic oil and gas production to try to appease the radical fringe elements of the environmental lobby, while groveling to Venezuela and Saudi Arabia for more oil supply to try to bring down prices for a moment for short-term political gain. This strategy makes absolutely no sense. We've got boundless domestic oil and gas reserves that are far better, environmentally speaking, and far better for Americans, economically speaking. Substantive regulatory and permitting reform is indeed long overdue. And so I'm glad we're having this conversation today, and I thank the chairman for convening the hearing. Mr. Obermueller, I'd like to start with you. As environmental groups have increased their opposition to the production of oil and natural gas on federal lands over the last 25 years, perhaps it comes as no surprise that in FY 2022, for the first time, 100% of the parcels posted for sale, where there were leases going on, were protested and litigated. 100%. That had never happened before. This kind of litigation, of course, targets permits, leases, licenses, permits for drilling and so forth, and of course NEPA analysis for wells, gathering lines, and pipelines. In a bill that I have called the Unshackle Act, I try to reform the NEPA process. This is a bill that I've introduced in the past and that I'll be reintroducing in Congress again soon. And I've proposed a uniform 150-day statute of limitations for all NEPA-related claims, along with tightening the requirements necessary in order to obtain prompt judicial review. Could you describe how these judicial reforms would add some more certainty to the permitting process for oil and gas projects?
Senator Lee, thank you for the question. I think, as you pointed out in your remarks, that we need to acknowledge that we have, perhaps inadvertently, but we certainly have established a system that incentivizes and rewards driving policy changes through the judicial branch. And whether it's your act, I know that I've seen iterations of that and appreciate that work, and other efforts specifically regarding taxpayer funding of reimbursements for litigation. We have to find ways to curtail that incentive and reward structure for repeated litigation not intended to correct an injustice necessarily. We all want access to courts for that, but to so-called correct procedural issues, really whatever you can come up with, because there's no skin in the game to repeatedly, file lawsuits on 100% of these projects.
Right. It's all gain at that point, because if you file it, you'll delay it. If you delay it, it may never happen. It might disappear. And then in the meantime, the BLM comes out and proposes this new rule earlier this week, which would hike royalty and rental rates, increase the bond and minimum bid amounts, and then establish a new fee for expressions of interest. And while these cost increases are garnering most of the attention surrounding the rule, and rightly so, I'm concerned about the preference criteria in the rule, which would give BLM even more discretion to direct oil and gas leasing toward areas that, quote, do not have sensitive cultural, wildlife, and recreation interests. This worries me, because it's going to create yet more discretion that will be used to discriminate even more at will against states where the president knows he's not going to lose many friends anyway, because he doesn't have many, and where there happens to be a whole lot of federal land. And that description, that profile, starts to look a lot like Utah and Wyoming and a handful of other states. This is worrisome to me. So how challenging will it be for producers in light of this rule with high development potential that the BLM does not arbitrarily deem to have cultural, wildlife, or recreational resources?
Senator, it's challenging, and I would add one more to that list that I think is important. Is one of the criteria that they're looking at, of course, is that the BLM would define what has high potential for development, low versus high potential. In Utah, from the Uinta Basin, and we know, of course, in Wyoming, every single acre at one point was low potential until technology made it high potential. So having the BLM be the arbiter of what has low and high potential is not the path we want to go down.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.